So I created another example called read and write a file to, and in this example, I have a main method. And in my main method, I'm going to set up a menu where I give the user options to interact with files. I also have a class called File.02. I'm going to use this class to create static methods to read and write to files. And then once I have this class created, I can take this class and put it into any of my projects to read and write to a file. So some of the things that I want to do with this File.02 is one method I want to create is to determine if a file exists. So I'm going to create a method that returns a Boolean value that's going to tell me if a file exists. So here's what I'm doing to determine if a file exists. I accept a string for the file name, then I create a file object, and there's a method called exists on that file object. So I'm simply just creating this file object and invoking the method exists. This is going to return true or false if that file exists. Now what I want to do is I want to create a method that's going to read all the content from a file and return the content as a string. I'm going to use the file reader and the buffered reader to do this. Alright, so this is what I'm doing for the method to read the file content. I created a method named getFileContent. It takes in a string. The string is going to be the name of the file. This method throws the input-output exception. This is what we call exception propagation. If an exception happens within this method, instead of handling it, it's going to force the caller to handle it. So wherever I call getFileContent, we're going to have to handle the input-output exception. Then I create a string builder object. The reason I use a string builder object is it's more efficient than using a string. Because a string is immutable, every time we concatenate to a string, we're actually creating a new string object in memory. So all those object creations can be really slow. So if we use a string builder, we use the same object in memory. So instead of creating multiple objects in memory as we concatenate, we're actually just using the same object. Then all the stuff that I did before in my previous example, I'm doing here, except I'm appending to my string builder. Then at the end of the method, I return out the string from the string builder. This is going to give me all the file content inside of a file. Now, if this file doesn't exist, it's going to throw an exception. I'm going to force that exception out of the method. So like I said before, whoever invokes this getFileContent is going to have to handle the input-output exception. Now what I want to do is I want to create a method to append to a file. So here's what I have to append to a file. I created a method called append to file. You pass in the name of the file, you pass in the content you want to append, then you pass in a Boolean value. This Boolean value is going to determine if you want to append to the last line or do we want to start a new line. I throw the input-output exception, so this is going to force the caller to handle the input-output exception. Then I check to see if the file exists. If the file does not exist, I return false. So I'm returning a Boolean to indicate whether or not I appended to the file. I create my writer objects, then I write the file content that's currently existing. So I simply just use the method that I created, getFileContent. This is going to get the existing file content and add it to the file. Then I check this Boolean value. If this is true, I'm going to create a new line. If this is not true, then I'm going to skip this and I'm going to go straight to writing the content. So this line is simply going to write the content that was passed to the method. So the content is being passed in. I'm going to close my writers. Then I'm going to return true. Returning true indicates that we appended successfully. The next thing I want to do is I want to overload this method so that we don't have to pass this in. In the overloaded version of this method, it's always going to make this true, meaning that we're going to append starting on a new line. And here's an overloaded method, append to file. I take in the file name, I take in the content. I simply just pass it to the append to file that accepts a Boolean value, but I pass in the Boolean value true. The reason I did this is now I can invoke the method append to file two different ways. If I just pass in the file name and the content, it's automatically going to add it to a new line. By passing the file name, the content, and a Boolean value, it's going to use the Boolean value to determine if it should be added to the new line or appended to the last line. So the last method I want to create is a method that's going to override the file content or create a new file with the file content. So here's the method I created, write to file. It takes in the file name and the content of the file that we want to write. It throws the input-output exception. So if an exception happens within this method, whoever invoked write to file will have to handle the input-output exception. Then I create a Boolean value, did overwrite. It's going to check to see if the file exists. If it does exist, this will be true. If it doesn't, did overwrite would be false. Then I create my writer objects and I simply write the content and I close my writers and I return the result of the Boolean value. So this class is ready to use in my driver, but before I use it, I'm going to go ahead and add some Java documentation. Alright, so I went ahead and added Java documentation. Now it's pretty thorough. I think it's important for classes like this to explain in detail what the method does and what every parameter does. So this is in Dropbox, so you can go through and read my Java documentation and see if you can make sense of my documentation. Now what I want to do is I want to come into my driver class. I'm going to create a menu to provide the user with options to read and write to a file. Okay, so here's my menu. I'm not going to go through all the details. It's exactly the same as the example that I did before, but this time I'm providing a menu option to see if a file exists, to read a file, or to write to a file. In my switch statement, I'm invoking these methods. these methods have not been fully created. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to check to see if a file exists. And here's what I'm doing to check to see if the file exists. I create a scanner object, then I prompt the user to enter the name of the file. I do the same thing that I did before where I ignore blank lines. Then I call the method doesFileExist. Now because this method is static, I just call this method straight through the class name. And if this returns true, the file exists. If it returns false, the file does not exist. So let's go ahead and test this method. Here's my menu. So currently in this project, I have no files. So there should be no files that exist. So I'm going to go ahead and enter C. I'm going to enter a name of a file. And it's telling me that test.txt does not exist. I'm going to go ahead and enter a Q to quit the program. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the method to read a file. So this is what I'm doing to read the file. Once again, I'm creating a scanner object. I'm prompting the user. I'm using this code to ignore blank lines. Then once I have the file name, I'm invoking the method getFileContent. Now because this method is static, I can call it directly through my class name. Now if you remember, this method can throw the input-output exception. So if the input-output exception is thrown, then here's what I'm printing out when I have an error. I'm saying an error occurred while reading the file, and then I print out the error message from the exception. If no error occurred, then I simply just print out the file content. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and run this program and see if I can read content of a file. Now here's my menu. Now I don't have any files that currently exist. So if I read any file, I'm going to get an error. So I'm going to enter an R to read file. I'm going to type in the name of a file, press enter, and here's the error message that I got. So one thing I want to do is I want to see if I can read in a file with my program. So here is my file menu, the one I'm just creating. I'm going to go ahead and copy this path. I'm going to come back to my program. I'm going to enter R to read a file. I'm going to paste in my path. I'm going to add my file. I'm going to press enter. And you can see that it did in fact find that file. It basically just printed out in my console all the Java code that I'm writing. So even though you don't have a file inside your project, you can reference a file on your system and this program will still read that file. So now what I want to do is I want to set up my write to file method. So this method is going to prompt the user for a file name and the file content. So I'm going to go ahead and create this method. So this is what I have for my write to file method. So I create a scanner object, then I prompt the user for the name of the file. Then I do what I do in order to ignore the blank lines and empty lines. And I ask the user how many lines does he want to write. I store that in number of lines, and then I clear out the end of line space. So there's an issue with the scanner class. If you do a token scan, then a line scan, the first line scan will grab the empty end of line character. So your first line will be empty. So in order to prevent that, you can clear the end of line character by just calling the method and not capturing the result. Then I declare a string builder, which is going to be my file content. I'm going to go through a loop. This is going to be equal to the number of times the user entered. But on the last line, I will not enter end of line character. This is going to prevent having a blank line at the bottom of the file. I check to see if the file exists. If the file exists, then I'm going to append to the file. If the file doesn't exist, then I'm going to write to the file. Now I put this comment here because what you should do if the file does exist, you should ask the user if he wants to overwrite the file or append to the file. Then we should also prompt the user for the option to append to the last line or append and add a new line. Now I did find a few problems in my Files.02 class. The first one is the buffer writer should close before the file writer. So I'm going to go ahead and reverse these. The same thing needs to be done for a reader. The other thing we need to do is right here, I'm calling the method getFileContent, but getFileContent is actually creating a file writer to read a file. So we're trying to read and write to the same file at the same time. So what I need to do is I need to call this method separately before I start trying to write to the file. So I'm going to remove this method. So I'm going to put the method up here, and I created a new string variable named existing content, and it's going to store the content of the file. So this is going to grab the previous content before we append to the file. Then I'm going to take this existing content and I'm going to write it right here. Now that's actually a very important step because we had a file reader and a file writer both trying to access the same file at the same time, and this is going to prevent any conflicts. Before I run the program and write a file, this is my IntelliJ folder. As you can see, there's no files in this folder, and by files I mean text files. So I'm going to go ahead and run my program. I'm going to create a new file. So here's my program. First thing I'm going to do is check to see if the file that I want to create exists. So I'm entering a C, the name of the file that I want to create. That file currently does not exist. So I'm going to enter in a W. I'm going to enter the name of the file that I want to create. I'm going to enter in 3 lines. Now I don't have a prompt to tell the user to start entering lines, so that's actually a bad thing. I should probably update my interface to say something, but I'm going to go ahead and enter my lines anyway. I entered in 3 lines. I'm going to press enter. I didn't get an error, so that means the file was created. If I go back to my IntelliJ folder, you can see the file exists, and this is what's inside the file. I'm going to close this file. So now what I want to do is I want to press R to read the file and enter the name of the file I want to read. And here's the content inside the file. So if I wanted to add to the file, I can press W, type the name of the file, type the number of lines that I want to add, and then add 2 lines. I want to press enter. And from this point, I want to read the file. So I'm going to press R, the name of the file. And here's my output. Now for some reason there's a space right here. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I'm going to go ahead and check the file. So here's my file. I'm going to open it, and there is a space there. So that means when I'm appending, I'm adding an extra space. I don't like that. So let me go to my File.util class and see what I did wrong. So here's my File.util class. What I see I'm doing wrong is this was true, so it added a new line. So if I don't like that, I need to pass in a false. Or what I can do is just change this value to false. That should fix it. So that's it. I wanted to give a detailed example of reading and writing to a file. Now, normally when you read and write to a file, you do create a utility class, which is going to handle all the reading and writing. And this file menu class is our driver class. So this is a class that's going to interact with the user.